So good morning, everyone. I guess some of you in the room might have to do a tech interview anytime in the next, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, or maybe have done one and couldn't quite figure out why it didn't go right. Well, we asked Adam Brand, who's one of our sponsors here from Protiviti. He's given this presentation before. Great response. I really want to thank him for coming back and really getting into sort of an in-depth issue of why tech interviews are so important in the process and how, even though you may be really great technically, you may be blowing the interview and what you really need to look with that. So let's give it up for Adam Brand from Protiviti.
All right. Thank you. Very much appreciated. So, as you can see here, I'm with Protiviti. I've done about, this is a little dated, this number's probably about 130 tech interviews in the past 18 months. So, do a lot of these types of things on a regular basis. So, go through the flow with each candidate, record my findings, and I actually keep a record of all the tech interviews that I do, just, what were the questions and what were the answers? I mean, I have a standard set of questions, but how did somebody answer that? And, throughout the tech interviews, I typically ask people to kind of give their rating of where they see themselves in a particular area, and then I put my own assessment of that after they answer the questions. So in coming up with this talk, I went back and reviewed a lot of that data and tried to condense, what are some of the key lessons that I could pull out of that? What are the things that people are doing in tech interviews that, in a lot of cases, they could be a great candidate, they just didn't come off well by the way that they handled the tech interview. So hopefully, you go through this, you'll pick up some tips. Many of these you already, may be doing, and that's great, but hopefully there's some new stuff in there. In terms of questions, feel free to poke in with a question at any time. You don't need to wait all the way to the end to do that, and I'm happy to take questions at the end as well if you want to hold them. So why should you hack a tech interview? So it's called hacking tech interviews, and we're hackers. We like to know what the system is, and I think it's kind of obligatory where if you're a hacker, you should try to hack all the things. So why not hack a tech interview? And by hacking, what I mean is understanding how the system works, and not necessarily trying to game it. You don't want to try to get a job that you're completely unqualified for, but at least understanding some of the fundamental rules will allow you to maximize your chances. So that's what I'm talking about from a hacking perspective. So these are the main areas that we'll go through today. One thing that's interesting about tech interviews is there's stuff that happens before the interview or should happen before the interview and after the interview that actually makes a huge difference in what your overall success rate will be for the interview. So I divided the talk up into these 3 areas, pre, during, and post. So you get a sense of what can you do to maximize your chances of success. So pre-interview. So pre-interview is resume time for the tech interviewer. I always review the resumes of people that I'm interviewing before I interview them, so I know what to ask them, right? I'm not going to ask somebody a bunch of Linux questions if they have no Linux background or knowledge. So here's an example skills section. How many people have a skills section on their resume? Most of you? Yeah. So does anyone see anything off potentially about this skills listing? Anything strike you as unusual, odd, questionable? Yep. Yeah, duplication, syntax issues, so lack of attention to detail, lack of detail in many cases. What jumped out at me from this one is if you look here, like the platforms, for example, they're listing anything from Windows 2K through VPN. I'm not sure what they're referring to there, which VPN, right? So they're listing all of those. I have no idea as a tech interview what that means. Does that mean you're aware that's an operating system that exists in the world? Does that mean that you have seen the source code for Windows as part of a private program and developed exploits? What does that mean, right? And so this is a common mistake that I see in these is people will just list out everything without any additional information about what do they know about those things. So here's another example that's a little bit different. Anyone see anything wrong with this this resume? Okay, HTTP, maybe not networking. Anything else? Think about this listing as a whole. Sorry? Yeah. Anyone else? Anything overall strike you about this skills listing? Doesn't detail their experience like we talked about. Anything else?
What's the difference between networking, routing, and switching?
Well, yeah. Okay. So yeah, there could be. Why did you separate routing and switching from networking, right? So what strikes me on this one as an example is these skills are just all over the board, right? What do you know? I mean, they have things in here like Notepad++. I mean, come on, like, right? Really? That's a skill? You can click an icon. It's not really, right? I mean, if you contributed to Notepad++, like in an open source fashion, fine, you should say that, but don't list that. I mean, there's stuff like that. They have, from anywhere from Python to C++, right? All this stuff in here, Perl and Bash, pretty much every single operating system known to man listed, right? Like, what are the likelihoods that you actually know all these things super well? Probably pretty low, right? And so as a tech interviewer, I'm like, I don't know what to do with this guy. Is he a networking guy, systems guy, database guy? I'll look at the rest of the stuff. But from a tech interview questions, this is all over the board. So kind of conclusion there is your resume is a roadmap for the tech interviewer. So have it lead somewhere good for you, right? Customize it to what's relevant. So, maybe you had, in a previous life, 10 years ago, done a lot of software development work and you touched a lot of different things. If the job that you're applying to now has nothing to do with software development, like it's a SOC analyst level 2 or something, don't list all that stuff. You can maybe summarize it briefly, but don't go through the whole laundry list. Always add context to the skills. So don't just say Windows, NT through Windows 2012 or whatever on the listing. Actually put some color around that, right? And I guess in terms of outdated stuff, it's not super relevant that you know Windows 2000 for most places, right? Unless you're like, I don't know, going into healthcare or something, and they have those things, right? You should stick with the more modern stuff. Yes?
So a question on that is it not from the purview? Yep. So a question on listing, let's say, a history of a longevity of operating system versions. Is that something that's not interesting to show a track record, or is that confusing to a tech interviewer?
I would say keep it to what's relevant in their head, right? I mean, they have a mental model for what they're looking for, and certainly they can see a resume in other areas to see that, in 2001 you were a systems administrator and you used Windows 2000 and Active Directory and things like that. But from a technical skills perspective, I'm looking for what does this person know today that I care about? And Windows 2000 probably not on that list of operating systems. So, I would certainly customize it, know your audience, what they're looking for. And also don't put down what you don't know. I think this is a pretty important one that we'll get into the interviews, but I've had people drop stuff down. I had a candidate a few months ago put down like, oh yeah, on the resume, list of skills, Kali Linux, expert or something like that. And I asked in the interview, okay, well, how do you get a listing of files at a shell prompt in Kali? Anyone know how to do that? LS, right? Didn't know. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, what's going on here? Just like, don't put down stuff that you don't know. Just because you used Kali once in a SANS class doesn't mean that you know it and can answer questions. And certainly, that did not fare well for that guy. So here's an example of a better skills listing. So does anyone see anything different about this that might make this a better skills listing as an interview roadmap? Yeah. Well, what does expert mean is another question, but just in terms of better than what we saw before.
Yeah, like how it's like expert, proficient, strong. I mean, it's like it gives you a little more idea than just putting Windows XP through whatever.
Right, experts, yeah. You can see the progression here of things that they feel like they have greater expertise in, all the way through things like, okay, I played with it a little bit, I generally get it, right? So I'm going to put it on. So yeah, certainly better. Here's another one that's even cleaner than that. And these are resume excerpts, like real excerpts. So you can see here they said something like clear understanding of intrusion prevention in all attacks associated. Okay, maybe not all attacks, that's a little much. But in general, I get what they're saying here. This is a lot better than just saying IPS, right? What does that mean? Does that mean you implemented a next-gen firewall that had an IPS function, or you actually set something up from scratch? So certainly, a lot better here. Years of configuring and experience in configuring and maintaining endpoint protection products. A lot of context, which is great. So here's another one. So in this case, it was broken up by technology domain, which I thought was kind of nice, easy to read. So here they talked about their experience with Microsoft technologies. How were they involved with Windows XP through Windows 8.1 in this case? They were involved because they had desktop support experience, right? So that's easy for me to understand. And then frequent experiences with Exchange 2017, right? So I know that they weren't the Exchange admin. Maybe they had at some point to, touch it, maybe for adding users or something like that. But it gives me a better roadmap. And then similarly at the bottom here, familiar with web input sanitization techniques, right? That's a lot better than listing like OWASP top 10 as a skill. So another thing is that you should keep in mind for these tech interviews, and a lot of people don't do this, but they don't really study for a tech interview. And I know that sounds kind of weird because you're supposed to be yourself in the interview, but I do feel that if you're going into a tech interview, there's a lot of areas of tech that you know pretty well, but you haven't touched in a little while. And so that area of your brain isn't active, right? Those synapses aren't firing and connected as much. So if you can go back and look at, okay, if you put on your resume, you're great at Windows, Active Directory, just go back and review the fundamentals ahead of time. Start preparing your brain for those types of questions. And also learn about what's new and changed. So, for folks that maybe did have a lot of experience with NT 2000, 2003, but that was a while ago and they haven't really gotten back and don't know what's new in 8 and 12, kind of brush up. Be like, I think that's perfectly valid. You didn't put on your resume that you had experience there, but if they start asking questions about Windows, you can say, hey, most of my experience stopped at 03, but I know that 12 has, much better, privilege separation or whatever it is, right? So be familiar with some of the improvements in these technologies. The other part is knowing your interviewer. So has anyone stalked their interviewer on LinkedIn at all? Okay, a good portion of you. For those that haven't, I highly recommend it. Essentially, you can look up your interviewer and figure out what's their background, right? If they're a huge software dev background, chances are they're going to focus on the software dev areas on your resume and ask you questions about that, probably because they don't feel as comfortable asking questions in other areas. So if you can get that context, it can help you prepare a little bit better. So during the interview, so one of the things that I think is important is, a lot of these interviews, they're going to start off, it's not going to start off cold just with questions like, hi, John, what's a GPO, right? It typically doesn't start like that. There's going to be some warm-up. So as part of that warm-up, take the opportunity to set some level set with the interviewer. So before we get into questions, they'll probably say, oh, how are you doing today, et cetera, et cetera. Great, I'm looking forward to talking with you. Just so you know, these are the areas of my resume. I know this is a tech interview. I'm generally the strongest in these areas because I had hands-on experience with them. I know something about these areas, because I was exposed to them for a short period of time. So if you help set the stage, then you're positioning the questions already to give yourself the best chance of success, right? Because if you're going in cold, maybe they haven't reviewed your resume in detail, they didn't have time, and they just start throwing a bunch of networking questions at you and you didn't have a huge networking background. If you can set that stage initially, you're much better, because then they're going to feel obligated to ask you more questions in the areas you say you know and fewer in the ones that you say you don't. So the other is proactively mentioning areas that you're working on, I think is good. So if there's an area that based on the job description that they wanted experience with, but you don't have it, I think that's perfectly valid. You can just say, hey, I noticed that you'd put on the job listing that you were looking for X. I'm not super deep in that, but it's something that I'm interested in. I hope to learn more in this position. I've just done some independent study on it, and I think it's a really interesting area. Whatever it is, just be upfront about those areas that you want to improve on, and then also be sure either at the start or at some point in the interview, to mention those extra activities that you've been doing, like coming to BSides, or if you have a home lab, like VM Lab or Cloud Lab set up and you play with different operating systems and try different things, mention that in the interview. Like, make sure that you get that in before the end. That carries a lot of weight with a lot of people that are in the community because it shows that you're an independent learner. You care about advancing your career. You're not going to be the kind of person that's going to be, clinging to everything that they've learned and not trying to learn new things. So also during interviews, here's some bad answers to interview questions. So I'd Google it. This is, you guys laugh. This is unfortunately a very common answer. So for anyone that's cyber stalking me, don't say I'd Google it. I know you can Google it. Anyone can Google anything. I think that's pretty self-evident. So when you get to a question that you don't know, I'll talk about some better ways to answer this. Certainly don't point out that you'd be able to look something up because I think that's, that's evident. Here's another. Yep.
I run across a lot of questions like this that are simplistic and referential tend to be.
Okay.
So how do you handle that, let's say in an interview situation where my blanket answer would be like, I'll just go look that up.
So what do you mean by simplistic?
So they're going to ask you reference questions, right? When you can easily just go look that up when it's important,
right.
versus having that memorized.
Yeah.
So it's like a professor in college saying you need to memorize every formula instead of teaching you theories and saying just go look up the formula. It's a reference item.
Yep.
You need to understand the theories behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll get into some ways to answer these better in a minute, but you're certainly expect to have those kinds of questions. As a technical interviewer, there's a good reason why we ask those questions. I ask some of those questions as well, and that is if you say that you are, close to an expert level in an area or very familiar with it, some of those basics I expect you to know right off the top of your head, right? Like if you're a Linux system administrator that set up IP tables, you should know how to flush IP tables or list the rules. Like if you have to go and look that up, how do you do your job every day, right? You're being constantly in Google. So there's a certain set as part of these that I'm like, okay, if you do this stuff every day, you shouldn't need to look this up. It should just be like this. Now, if you say that you have some infrequent exposure to that, then I'll be fine if you say you don't know the answer or answer it another way. So this is the second one. I am Googling it as the answer. Now, to be fair, many candidates don't actually say, I'm Googling it, but I can hear their keyboards, right? You can tell if it's like, oh, I don't know, what are the FSMO roles on Active Directory? And you hear click, 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 and long pauses, and then it's like, oh, okay, RID master, schema master. I'm like, okay, yeah, I know what you just did there. And I haven't actually called anyone out on it because it's kind of an embarrassing thing, but we notice, right? Even if you're on your phone and you don't have a clickety-clack keyboard, I can usually tell if you're Googling it because you'll be answering a lot of other questions and I try to keep the pace, right? And then there'll just be a pause. You're like, I'm pretty sure what you're not doing now is like racking your brain. I'm pretty sure you're typing on your phone. So, yeah.
Is it ever wise to indicate to the interviewer that these are very poor questions if they're just trivia stuff? Like they should be asking you about concepts. Really, I find I feel like trivia is not a very good test of someone's expertise.
So
like it's not a pub quiz, right? Like that's the thing.
Well, I mean, it depends, right? Yeah, I mean, certainly there's the importance of concepts. And there will be questions, you would think there'd be questions on concepts. If you feel the entire interview was trivia, it's up to you how you'd want to handle that situation. Personally, I don't think it's a good approach to call them out on that because that's creating a confrontational situation that you're not going to win. So, I mean, if you don't want to work for that company, I would say call them out on that. If you want to work for them, then I would talk more about what you do know in those areas.
It just
right?
seems that they've made no effort if that's the case. Like I've been in interviews before where they have this, so in like development interviews,
Yeah.
and they'll just flick to, there's like this book that they use for all these like top end interviews, and they'll just flick to the hard section. And they'll say, give me an n log n implementation of this sorting algorithm.
Yeah.
And you just like, why is memorizing that so important? Wouldn't it be more important to compare and contrast the different ones? It's like,
yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, people that are relying solely on those types of questions probably, aren't in they're potentially not even in the role that understands the answers, and they may just be looking up the answers themselves, and they don't have the knowledge maybe to even ask those conceptual questions. So how to handle it, as I said, I probably wouldn't call them out on it. I would try and put your best foot forward and explain what you do know about those related concepts.
Another thing that sucks, like to answer that kind of from a point of view of somebody that interviews all the time, and it's part of my job, sometimes we have to, well, not sometimes, depending on what company you work for, you have to ask the same questions to everybody. So it's almost like, I know this sucks, but let's get through it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other one, anyone know who this is? Very confident vanilla ice, yeah. So the other way not to answer interview questions is completely guessing, but guessing really confidently, right? Like, I know that we have experience with social engineering and stuff like this, but yeah, don't try this at home on an interviewer, tech interviewer, and they're going to be able to tell, right, if they know their stuff. So, but this happens all the time, where I'll go with, be interviewing a candidate, and they're confidently giving me completely wrong, obtuse answers to everything, just boom after boom, and you're like, what are you even doing right now? And it's, I was interviewing a guy for a variety of positions, but he had been a PCI QSA, right? So there's a certain body of knowledge you need to know, and I was asking him relevant questions, like, what port does Telnet use, right? Because that's a big insecure protocol call down. Just like constantly like, oh, that's port 10. I'm like, no, it's not a thing. Like, how do you, what's a GPO? And he's like, oh, I don't. Yeah, it's just a way to group users together. I'm like, no, pretty sure that's not it.
Another question over here.
Oh, the best question is, what port does ping use?
Yeah, what port does ping use? Yeah.
So I have a question on that. So like, hold on.
Oh.
You guys are making me run here. I'm out of shape. What port is pink? No, I'm just kidding.
Tell me more about this ping. It sounds interesting.
ICMP?
Is it related to Pong, the game?
So trick questions.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if it's on the slide. Maybe it is. But like, I can't stand trick questions. And I mean, I get it. But I feel like it's sort of like the whole like lure and bait type thing. And, I think that's those questions. I've gotten those from like big companies.
Do you feel that's a trick, or is that a basic understanding of the situation? Like,
I think it's a trick.
There's definitely situations where you set people up to fail.
Well, yeah, and I'm not talking about that. I actually have gotten that specific question, but I mean that's easy.
Yeah.
When they do that same methodology on a harder question, you're just kind of like, huh, and they're like, well, there really is no right answer because I made it all up, or whatever.
Yeah.
That's like the CISP.
Yeah, right.
Ouch.
So I have a question about the Googling thing, and I totally got this. Like, few questions. For this one, I know the technology. So something like you're asking me, how do you log into Facebook? Now, I have never seen Facebook, but I use Twitter. So I'll say, okay, I have not used Facebook, but I have used Twitter, and I'm assuming both the technologies will be same. So it might be using username and password. I'm guessing it, but I'm telling you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's valid, right? If you're not just spitting out the answer saying you know it, if you're providing, an alternative question, I think that's valid. I'll take it. It shows some critical thinking. Obviously that was a simplistic example, but in other cases, yeah, certainly I'm up for that.
Yeah, and one more
Yeah.
about the Googling again.
Yeah.
So sometimes when they ask complex questions, it requires some thinking. I'm not Googling, but I'm recollecting my thoughts and putting it in an order.
Okay.
Instead of jumping right at the sign in button, I'm jumping, okay, username, password, and then sign in.
Yeah.
It requires some thinking.
Yeah, that's valid. I mean, I
So-
think it depends on the complexity of the question, right? If
Right.
I'm asking you, example port question, and you think for a really long time about what port SSH is on, and you're like a Linux administrator, like, yeah, So yeah, certainly there are cases. I would expect if I'm asking somebody more of a complex conceptual question that there would be some pauses. And those are the questions you can't really Google an answer to anyway. So perfectly fine with people taking time to answer those. So I'm going to move on. We'll take some more questions at the end. I know we're running a little short on time. So some of the things, I don't just Google it, don't make something up. So to your point, explain what you know about the topic and or your best guess. So if you don't know what port ping runs on, if you don't know a particular answer, I think it's best for you to say, this is what I know about that area, right? Like, if I ask you what logging facility, I don't know, authentication happens on a Red Hat box, you could say, well, I'm not super in the weeds on that part of it. However, I understand that there's this idea of logging facilities in different levels, and they could go to different locations based on what you specify in syslog file and stuff like that. So if you explain what you do know about that, even if you don't have the answer, a ton better than saying you don't know or trying to Google it or something like that. So the other part in the interview is try to make a connection with this. I know a lot of these can be rapid fire interviews. Try to make time before or after the interview to establish some type of rapport. I know this is kind of like a tech interview, but tech interviewers are people too. Like we have a soul. So you can mention something from their LinkedIn profile, like, hey, I saw on your profile you spoke at DEF CON. That's really cool. I'd like to do that someday. Tell me more about that. Or I saw that you used to do network engineering. I used to do it too. What type of stuff were you? Routing and switching, firewalls. So you try to find some commonalities or ask some questions, not of a personal nature, but more personal than just you would otherwise have in a conversation. And a key here is also ask questions at the end. This is kind of like interviewing 101, but have questions and ask them. So after the interview, one of the things that I find interesting is I said I've done maybe 130 tech interviews at this point. I have probably received 3 follow-up emails, thank you emails, after the interviews. How many of you send thank you emails? Oh, wow, a lot of you. Okay. That's pretty awesome. Maybe it's just me. Maybe people are like, that guy's an asshole. So yeah, I think this is a key part, and a lot of people forget about this. You just went through this intense interview. You're not sure where you ended up. Extremely important. This is a way that you can help recover from potentially missed answers, right? So I'll show an example here. So here's an example of simple thank you. This takes 2 seconds to write. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for your consideration. It's an exciting opportunity for me, right? Very easy. And what this tells me is that this person is actually maybe interested in this position, which is important, right? I know security is kind of a hot area, and a lot of people are vying for a small pool of qualified candidates. But nobody likes to feel on the interviewer side that they're just one of many choices, and they should be lucky to have you. The people that you want to select someone that's actually interested in working for your company. And this is a way of showing that. It's like, hey, this is cool. I'm excited to work with you guys. Very simple, easy to do. Here's a more in-depth one. I thought this was really cool. And this kind of upped the grade for this guy after the tech interview. And he did okay anyway. But essentially, after the tech interview, where he had missed some questions, he sent me an email, a thank you email. But he's like, I was really curious about some of the things that you asked me about. And I went and looked them up, and this is what I found, right? That was pretty awesome. I'm like, this guy's pretty curious. He went through this tech interview, and he remembered, oh man, I didn't know that. I felt like I should have known that. And he had the curiosity, the intellectual curiosity to go out and find the answer and take the time to explain it, which I thought was really nice. So certainly take the time to do these emails. Even a simple one will make a big difference. So I think do we have any more time for questions, or are we at the end?
We do have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Yep.
I'm going to do ladies first and then you.
No, I've already talked.
Okay.
So this is a quick one. The resume length, what do you think? Because is 2 pages too long? Because all I ever hear is 1 page, 1 page, 1 page. But then when you start listing out all your experience and like more specifically, not just kind of listing out the operating systems and stuff, how can you like keep all that? Is it horrible if it's more than 1 page?
This is kind of a hot button topic. I know it's kind of, a lot of people have different opinions. So you may get, many other opinions in this room. My opinion is that this is based on your experience, right? If you have less than 5 years experience, I'd probably expect a one-page interview. As it goes more than that,
One-page resume?
Or one-page resume, sorry. As it goes longer than that, I'd expect to see more information. 2 pages is probably fine. I think 2 pages is typically the max that I like seeing. If somebody has a really long career in something and they've done a lot of cool stuff and it goes over to 3 pages, I'm probably fine with that. But if the reason it's 3 pages, and this is more of like a US versus international like CV thing, but for the US at least, if it's 3 pages because they have like their entire university curriculum on it, like that's not important to me as a tech interviewer. Please leave that stuff off. I'm not going to read 20 different bullets. Yeah, sorry. Am I available to review resumes? Oh, okay. I could probably do 1 or 2. I wasn't planning on it, but I think I'm free, so I can hop over. Yeah.
Hi. As a security professional, I'm really conflicted about this, and I'd like to hear your opinion. Everyone's going to have their own, but LinkedIn.
Okay.
I mean, I just abhor the idea of them harvesting my data, and knowing who I know and who I work with. If they paid me something, I'd be glad to get on it, but I'm not on it. And I notice that everyone that's looking for a job is on it, and you just mentioned I was just curious, if I'm not on LinkedIn, is that a plus or is that a minus?
For a job search, I'd say it's a minus. I'll also go look up candidates on LinkedIn. It's kind of interesting to see if we know people in common, right? And I sometimes look at those little reviews and stuff just to get a better sense of that person. So maybe the rest of the year you disable your profile or remove the information, but if you're interviewing, I'd recommend having one up there. I think it adds a certain level of credibility to show the number of connections that you might have that are mutual, and just all the other information on there.
And remember that you can go into the privacy settings and shut down your network, so it's only you. One last question.
Yeah. So on the tech questions, do you ever let the candidates know they got something wrong and see how they recover? And have you ever cut an interview short?
So do I let the candidates know? I'd say usually not, because there's a lot of questions to go on in a shorter period of time. If they ask me specifically, I will tell them whether or not they got something right. But typically, there's lots to do in the interview, so I'll just go through them and carry on. Will I cut it short? Yes. So if we're going through Windows questions, I'll typically ask questions until they start to get some wrong, depending on what their knowledge level is. Like if they said they were just basic Windows, I'm not going to ask them super advanced questions, but I typically progress and then go to the next thing. And if somebody is really not knowledgeable at all or answering things really incorrectly and confidently, I will shut down the interview and early. I'm not going to go through the rest of this. We're going to save both ourselves time. So.
Well, let's thank Adam for his time and expertise this morning.